The deep rumble of motorcycle engines shattered the calm of the countryside as the steel reapers roared down the gravel road, their bikes kicking up clouds of dust that clung to the fading sunlight. The gang had made their presence known across the county for weeks, leaving a trail of vandalized properties, stolen goods, and intimidated locals. Today they were looking for a new place to stake their claim, and they had chosen the wrong one. The farmhouse stood solitary on the edge of the woods, its white paint chipped and its porch weathered by time. But the land it sat on stretched for miles, a sprawling expanse of fields, barns, and timber that practically invited trouble. To the steel reapers, it seemed like easy pickings. Their leader, a hulking man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, revved his engine before cutting it off. The other bikers followed suit, their laughter coarse and loud as they dismounted. They scanned the property with greedy eyes, already imagining what they could take. The leader turned to his crew, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. "Looks like nobody's home," he said, his voice dripping with confidence. "Let's have a look around." Inside the house, Jack Barrett sat at his kitchen table, the soft sound of country music crackling from an old radio. The retired Army Ranger was in the middle of cleaning his rifle, a ritual he had never let go of, even after decades away from the battlefield. His movements were methodical, almost meditative, as he wiped down the barrel. His hands, calloused from years of service, moved with the precision of a man who had once relied on his weapons to stay alive. Jack froze when he heard the low growl of the motorcycles outside. His sharp blue eyes flicked to the window, narrowing as he saw the bikers congregating in his driveway. He set the rifle down and rose slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow across the room. Though his body bore the marks of time, aching knees, a slight limp, there was nothing diminished about the fire in his gaze. He had faced enemies far more dangerous than these men, and he had survived. But he also knew that survival required caution. He moved to the window, keeping himself out of sight as he observed the gang. There were at least 6 of them, all wearing matching leather jackets emblazoned with a skull and chain logo. They were laughing, shouting, and pointing at different parts of his property like hyenas circling prey. Jack recognized the leader from descriptions in the local news, a man named Rocco, known for his brutality and his knack for getting away with it. A loud knock rattled the front door, followed by Rocco's gruff voice. "Hey, old man, we know you're in there. Come out and make this easy." Jack's jaw tightened, his mind already running through his options. He didn't want bloodshed, but he wasn't about to let these men take what he had spent his life building. His gaze flicked to the photographs on the wall, images of his late wife, their wedding day, his son holding up a trophy at a high school football game. This house, this land, was his legacy. He wasn't going to let it be defiled by a group of thugs. Jack stepped toward the door, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. He paused to adjust his weathered hat, then reached for his cane, a sturdy piece of oak that doubled as a weapon if necessary. The rifle stayed on the table for now. He had no intention of escalating things unless they left him no choice. He cracked the door open, just enough to see Rocco's sneering face on the other side. The gang leader leaned casually against the porch railing, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His crew stood behind him, their smirks dripping with arrogance. "You've got about 10 seconds to turn those bikes around and leave," Jack said, his voice steady but firm. Rocco laughed, a deep, mocking sound that made his crew chuckle in unison. "And what if we don't, old-timer? You gonna call the cops?" Jack didn't flinch. "If I have to." Rocco stepped closer, his boots thudding against the porch. "Look at you," he said, smirking. "Living out here all alone, thinking you're some kind of cowboy. Newsflash, Gramps, this ain't your war and you ain't in charge." Jack's grip on the cane tightened, but his expression didn't waver. "Last warning." The gang's laughter erupted again, one of the bikers stepping forward to toss an empty beer can onto the porch. It clattered against the wood, the sound loud and deliberate. Rocco's smirk twisted into a snarl. "We're staying. And maybe you should start thinking about how much you like this house, old man. Would be a shame if something happened to it." Jack exhaled slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "You shouldn't have done that." The gang's bravado faltered for a split second as Jack's words hung in the air. Rocco's sneer returned quickly, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He opened his mouth to respond, but Jack had already stepped forward, standing tall on the porch. "You picked the wrong house," Jack said, his voice sharp as steel. "And the wrong man." Jack stood on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. The Steel Reapers stood frozen for a moment, their bravado faltering under the weight of his words. But the hesitation was brief. Rocco's sneer returned, and he motioned for one of his men to step forward. The biker, a younger man with a shaved head and a crude knife strapped to his belt, swaggered up to the porch. "You think you're tough, old man?" he said, reaching for the handle of his knife. "Why don't you come down here and show us?" Jack didn't move. His steel blue eyes locked on the biker, unflinching. "Why don't you come up here and find out?" The gang chuckled, but there was an edge of unease in their laughter. Jack's calmness wasn't just unnerving, it was disarming. Men like Rocco thrived on intimidation, and this man, standing tall and steady, was an anomaly they didn't quite know how to handle. The younger biker's grin faded. He glanced back at Rocco, who nodded sharply. Encouraged, the man pulled the knife from his belt and took a step toward the porch. Jack moved faster than anyone expected. His cane swung in a sharp arc, striking the biker's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the ground, and the man stumbled back, clutching his arm and swearing loudly. Before anyone else could react, Jack stepped down from the porch, his cane at the ready. "That's enough," Jack said, his voice low and commanding. "I told you to leave. You didn't listen. Now you're going to regret it." Rocco growled, shoving another gang member forward. This one was larger, with a bat slung over his shoulder. "Take care of him!" Rocco snapped. The man with the bat hesitated, eyeing Jack warily. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Now!" Rocco barked. With a reluctant nod, the man swung the bat toward Jack. But Jack was ready. He sidestepped the blow with surprising agility, hooking his cane around the biker's ankle and yanking hard. The man toppled to the ground, the bat slipping from his grasp. Jack planted a foot on the bat, leaning forward with the cane pressed against the biker's chest. "This is your last chance," Jack said, his voice calm but deadly. "Walk away." The rest of the gang shifted uneasily, their confidence cracking. Rocco, however, wasn't ready to back down. He stepped forward, drawing a crowbar from his bike. "Enough of this," he growled. "You think you're tough because you got lucky? Let's see how tough you are now." Jack's grip on the cane tightened, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. "Hey!" a voice called from the side of the yard. All heads turned to see Frank, Jack's old army buddy, standing near the edge of the property. He held a shotgun casually over one shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Thought you could use some backup," Frank said, stepping closer. Jack allowed himself the faintest smile. "Took you long enough?" Frank shrugged. "Traffic." Rocco's eyes narrowed as he glanced between the two older men. "You think one more old man is going to make a difference?" he sneered. "We outnumber you 10-2. Frank cocked the shotgun, the sound echoing across the yard. "You want to test that theory?" The tension was palpable. For a moment, it seemed like the bikers might retreat, but Rocco's pride wouldn't let him back down. He raised the crowbar, barking at his men. "Take them down!" The gang surged forward, their weapons raised. Jack and Frank moved in tandem, their years of training kicking in like second nature. Jack swung his cane with precision, using it to block strikes and disarm attackers. Frank kept to the perimeter, the shotgun acting more as a deterrent than a weapon. One biker lunged at Jack with a chain, but Jack ducked under the swing and jabbed the cane into the man's ribs, sending him sprawling. Another tried to tackle him, only to be met with a swift kick that left him gasping for air. Frank fired a warning shot into the air, freezing the bikers in their tracks. "Anyone else want to try their luck?" he asked, his tone dangerously calm. The gang hesitated, their confidence eroding with each failed attack. Even Rocco seemed unsure now, his grip on the crowbar tightening as he glanced at his fallen men. "This isn't over," Rocco growled, stepping back toward his bike. Jack stepped forward, his cane tapping against the ground with deliberate intent. "It's over when I say it's over," he said. "Get your men, get your bikes, and get off my land." Rocco glared at him, his jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue, but the weight of defeat was clear in his eyes. With a sharp whistle, he motioned for his crew to retreat. The bikers scrambled to their feet, grabbing their weapons and limping back to their bikes. Rocco was the last to mount his face a mask of rage and humiliation. "You'll regret this," he spat. "We'll be back." Jack didn't flinch. "And I'll be waiting." The roar of engines filled the air as the gang sped away. their retreat marked by a trail of dust and shattered pride. Jack stood in silence, watching them disappear down the road. Frank walked over, lowering the shotgun and letting out a low whistle. "Still got it," Frank said, clapping Jack on the shoulder. Jack exhaled slowly, his grip on the cane relaxing. "They'll be back," he said quietly. Frank nodded. "Probably, but they'll think twice next time." The two men turned toward the farmhouse, the adrenaline beginning to wear off. Inside, the house was still and quiet, the tension lingering like a shadow. Jack glanced at the pictures on the wall as he stepped inside, his mind already planning the next steps. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jack stood on the porch, watching as the dust kicked up by the Steel Reapers' retreating bikes finally settled. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, leaving the evening eerily quiet. The adrenaline coursing through his veins began to wane, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He leaned on his cane, taking a moment to steady his breathing. Frank stood beside him, shotgun still slung over his shoulder, scanning the horizon as if expecting the gang to double back. "They'll regroup," Frank said after a moment, his voice low but certain. "Guys like that don't take a loss lightly." Jack nodded, his eyes still fixed on the road. "I know, they're not the type to let this go." Frank glanced at him. "You got a plan?" Jack straightened, gripping his cane tightly. "Always." The two men stepped back into the house, the weight of the confrontation still heavy in the air. Inside, Sarah was waiting, her face pale with worry. She had been peeking through the curtains, clutching her children tightly as the chaos unfolded outside. Now she rushed forward, her voice trembling. "Grandpa, you shouldn't have gone out there. What if they—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes darting to the streak of blood on Jack's sleeve. "You're hurt!" "It's nothing," Jack said, brushing her concern aside. "A scratch." "But—" Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze firm but gentle. "Sarah, listen to me. I'm not going to let them take what's ours, not while I'm still breathing." Sarah swallowed hard, nodding despite the tears welling in her eyes. "What do we do now?" "We prepare," Jack said simply. "They'll be back, and when they come, we'll be ready." The next morning, Jack and Frank got to work. They walked the perimeter of the property, assessing every potential point of entry. The old barn, the tool shed, the driveway, all of it needed reinforcing. Jack's military training kicked in as he devised a plan to turn the farmhouse into a fortress. "We need more eyes," Frank said as they stood by the barn. "A couple of us won't cut it if they come back in full force." Jack nodded. "I've got some calls to make." By noon, the first of Jack's reinforcements arrived. They were old friends, men Jack had served with decades ago. Some walked with canes, others carried the weight of their years and their tired eyes, but all of them shared a resolute determination. They had fought alongside Jack before, and they weren't about to let him face this fight alone. One by one, more veterans trickled in, each bringing their own skills and resources. Some brought tools to help fortify the property, while others carried firearms, first aid supplies, and even surveillance equipment. The quiet farmhouse transformed into a hive of activity as the men worked together, each movement purposeful. Sarah watched from the porch, a mix of awe and anxiety in her expression. "It's like a scene from one of those old war movies," she said softly to Frank. Frank chuckled. "Except, this one's for real." Jack oversaw the preparations, his sharp mind piecing together every detail. He set up barricades along the driveway, reinforced the windows with plywood, and even rigged a few traps in the surrounding woods. It wasn't about creating an impenetrable fortress. It was about buying enough time to outlast the gang's aggression. By nightfall, the property was ready. Jack and his team gathered in the living room, the warm glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows across their faces. The air was thick with unspoken tension, each man silently acknowledging the gravity of what lay ahead. "They'll come when they think we're vulnerable," Jack said, addressing the group. "Probably under cover of darkness, maybe early morning, but they'll come." "And when they do?" one of the veterans asked. Jack's gaze hardened. "We hold the line. This isn't about pride or proving a point. This is about protecting what's ours." The men nodded, their resolve unshaken. They had faced worse odds before, and they would face them again. The attack came just before dawn. The faint rumble of engines was the first sign, growing louder as the Steel Reapers approached. Jack, already awake and alert, moved quickly to rouse the others. The veterans took their positions, each man knowing exactly where to be and what to do. The gang's arrival was louder and more aggressive than before. They revved their engines, shouting threats as they spread out across the property. Rocco led the charge, his crowbar gleaming in the dim light. "Let's finish this!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the crisp morning air. The veterans held their ground. From the barn, Frank fired a warning shot, the sound cutting through the chaos and momentarily halting the gang's advance. "That's as far as you go," he called out. Rocco snarled, waving his men forward. "Take them down!" The fight that followed was intense and chaotic. The gang used their brute force, trying to overwhelm the veterans with sheer numbers, but Jack's preparations held strong. Barricades slowed their progress. Traps in the woods caught a few off guard, and the veterans' strategic positioning turned the farmhouse into a defensive stronghold. Jack moved with the precision of a man half his age. He wielded his cane like a weapon, disarming one biker and sending another sprawling with a well-placed strike. Frank provided cover from the barn, his shotgun ensuring the gang couldn't gain too much ground. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. Finally, as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the gang began to falter. Their confidence eroded, their numbers dwindling as one by one, they retreated under the relentless pressure. Rocco was the last to stand, his pride refusing to let him admit defeat. He swung his crowbar wildly, but Jack met him head-on. With a swift, calculated move, Jack disarmed him, sending the crowbar clattering to the ground. Jack leveled him with a single piercing glare. "Leave," Jack said, his voice low and deadly, "and don't come back." Defeated, Rocco spat on the ground before turning and limping back to his bike. The remaining gang members followed, their heads hung low. They roared away, leaving behind nothing but a trail of dust and broken pride. As the sun rose fully, casting a warm glow over the battered property, Jack and his team stood together, surveying the aftermath. The farmhouse bore the marks of the fight, splintered wood, trampled grass, but it still stood, a testament to their resilience. Sarah emerged from the house, her children clinging to her sides. She looked at Jack, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening. "This is our home. I'll always protect it." Frank clapped him on the back, grinning. "Well, Jack, I'd say you've still got it." Jack chuckled, the tension finally easing. "We all do." The veterans shared a quiet moment of camaraderie, their bond forged anew in the fires of battle. They had defended their own, stood their ground, and sent a message that would not be forgotten. The Steel Reapers had picked the wrong fight, and they paid the price.